By 1975, you couldn't find a new gasoline-powered Class 8 truck on American roads. The big block was dead. Cummins killed it. To understand how diesel won, we need to go back to when gasoline was king. Picture America in 1952. The interstate system doesn't exist yet, but trucks are everywhere. The war is over, the economy is booming, and everything needs to move. Refrigerators from factories in Michigan to showrooms in California, steel from Pittsburgh to construction sites in Texas, produce from farms to cities that never stop growing, and every single one of those trucks runs on gasoline. A fleet operator in Ohio named Harold Simmons ran 43 trucks that year. Every one of them had a big block V8 under the hood. His mechanics had grown up tearing apart Ford flatheads and Chevy straight sixes. They knew gasoline engines like they knew their own families. Diesel? That was for ships, for locomotives, for European farmers who couldn't afford real fuel, not for American trucks doing real American work. This wasn't stubbornness, it was logic. Gasoline engines were everywhere. Parts were cheap. Any mechanic in any town could fix one. The big V8s from GMC, Ford, and International Harvester made good power, started easy in cold weather, and ran smooth enough that drivers didn't complain. Sure, they drank fuel like sailors on shore leave, but fuel was cheap, 20 cents a gallon cheap. When diesel cost about the same and got you maybe 30% better mileage, the math didn't work. You'd spend years paying off a diesel engine before you saw any savings. And diesel had problems, real problems. The early diesel trucks that did exist were rough. They shook, they smoked, they smelled like a refinery fire. Starting one in January meant praying and cursing in equal measure. The engines were heavier, which meant less payload. They cost more up front, and when something broke, good luck finding a mechanic who knew what he was looking at. Imagine telling a 1950s trucker that gasoline engines would vanish from heavy trucks within 20 years. He'd laugh you off the lot. Then he'd climb into his GMC with its 300 horsepower gas V8 and haul another load across the country, burning a gallon every 4 miles and not thinking twice about it. The trucking industry had found what worked. Gasoline was familiar, available, and good enough. Nobody was looking for a revolution. But while American truckers stuck with what they knew, a company in Columbus, Indiana, was betting everything on a different fuel. They'd been building diesel engines since 1919, and they were about to change the entire industry. Clessie Cummins never went to engineering school, never got a formal education in mechanics. He learned by taking things apart and putting them back together, usually in the wrong order the first few times. By his early 20s, he was working as a chauffeur for a wealthy banker in Columbus, Indiana, a man named William Glanton Irwin. And while driving Irwin around, Clessie kept tinkering, kept building, kept failing. In 1919, Clessie convinced Irwin to back him in starting an engine company, not a gasoline engine company, a diesel engine company. At the time, this was roughly equivalent to starting a company that made square wheels. Diesel engines existed, sure. They powered ships and factories, massive stationary units that weighed tons and required teams of specialists to operate. Nobody thought you could put one in a truck. The engines were too heavy, too unreliable, too expensive, and too complicated for anything mobile. Clessie thought differently. The early years were brutal. The Cummins Engine Company produced engines that broke constantly. Fuel injection systems failed, seals leaked, pistons cracked. The company hemorrhaged money year after year, while Clessie and his small team tried to solve problems that the entire European diesel industry hadn't figured out yet. Irwin kept writing checks. Most investors would have walked away after the second year of losses, where Irwin stayed for over a decade. Here's the thing about Clessie Cummins. Every failure taught him something. When an injector clogged, he redesigned it. When a cylinder cracked, he changed the metallurgy. When the whole engine seized up in cold weather, he developed better starting systems. He wasn't just building engines, he was building knowledge. accumulating solutions to problems nobody else had bothered to solve because nobody else thought truck diesels were worth the trouble. By the late 1920s, Clessie had something that almost worked. Almost. The engines ran. They produced power. They burned fuel efficiently, but they still weren't reliable enough for commercial use. No trucking company was going to buy an engine that might strand their driver in the middle of nowhere. Clessie needed to prove that diesel could be trusted. So in 1930, he did something that most people thought was insane. He took a diesel-powered truck and drove it from New York City to Los Angeles, coast to coast. Over 3,000 miles of roads that ranged from paved highways to dirt tracks to mountain passes that would challenge a mule. The engine had to work perfectly the entire way. One major breakdown, and the whole stunt would prove his critics right. The truck made it. And here's the number that changed everything. The entire trip cost $11.22 in fuel. That's it. A gasoline truck making the same journey would have burned through $50 worth of fuel, maybe more. The savings weren't 10%, they weren't 20%, they were nearly 80%. Clessie didn't stop there. He entered diesel-powered cars in the Indianapolis 500. He drove a diesel bus from New York to Los Angeles. He kept staging publicity stunts that demonstrated the same thing over and over. Diesel engines used dramatically less fuel than gasoline engines. The math was undeniable. But trucking companies still hesitated. Fuel savings meant nothing if the engine left you stranded. And early Cummins engines, despite the successful publicity runs, still had reliability issues in everyday use. The coast-to-coast trips were carefully prepared. Mechanics checked everything before departure. Spare parts traveled with the vehicles. Real-world trucking didn't work that way. You loaded up, you drove, and you hoped nothing broke. Through the 1930s, Cummins kept refining, kept improving. Each generation of engines lasted longer than the last. The company developed better fuel injection systems, stronger components, more robust cooling. By the end of the decade, Cummins had built something that trucking companies could actually depend on. The engines still cost more than gasoline alternatives, but they lasted longer, used less fuel, and increasingly they didn't break down. The reputation for durability started spreading through the trucking industry. Word of mouth from drivers who put hundreds of thousands of miles on their Cummins engines without major failures. From fleet operators who watched their fuel bills drop while their maintenance costs stayed flat. Cummins had spent over a decade losing money before selling a single profitable engine. Most companies would have quit. They didn't. The fuel efficiency advantage was clear, but trucking companies needed more than economy. They needed an engine that wouldn't break down in Wyoming at 2 in the morning. So let's talk about what was actually happening inside these engines. Because the difference between diesel and gasoline isn't just about fuel, it's about fundamental physics. And once you understand the physics, you understand why gasoline never stood a chance. Start with compression. Your gasoline engine, the one in your car, runs a compression ratio of about 8-to-1. Maybe 9-to-1 if it's a performance engine. That means the piston squeezes the air and fuel mixture to 1/8 of its original volume before the spark plug fires. That's how gasoline engines work. Spark ignition. You need that spark to start the combustion. Diesel doesn't work that way. A Cummins diesel from this era ran compression ratios around 16-to-1, some went even higher, 17-to-1, 18-to-1. At those compression ratios, the air gets so hot from being squeezed that when you inject the fuel, it ignites on its own. No spark plug needed. The heat does the work. That's compression ignition. Now here's why that matters. Higher compression means higher thermal efficiency. That's a fancy way of saying the engine extracts more useful work from every drop of fuel. A gasoline engine of this era converted maybe 20 to 25% of the fuel's energy into actual motion. The rest became heat, wasted heat. A diesel converted 30 to 35%, sometimes more. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between profit and bankruptcy when you're burning thousands of gallons a week. But wait, it gets worse for gasoline. Diesel fuel itself contains more energy per gallon than gasoline, about 15% more. So you're starting with a fuel that packs more punch, and you're burning it in an engine that wastes less of it. The math was brutal. A diesel truck could go 30 to 40% farther on the same amount of fuel money. At highway speeds, running loaded day after day, that advantage compounded into serious money. Then there's torque. And this is where gasoline really fell apart for trucking. Your car's engine makes its power by spinning fast. A gasoline V8 might make peak horsepower at 5,000 RPM, peak torque at 3,000. To get the power out, you have to rev it. That's fine for a car. It's a disaster for a truck. A gasoline big block making 300 horsepower had to spin at 4,000 RPM to get there. A Cummins diesel made the same power at 1,800 RPM. Think about that. Less than half the engine speed for the same output. Lower engine speed means less wear on every moving part. Pistons aren't flying up and down as fast. Valves aren't opening and closing as often. Bearings aren't spinning as hard. The crankshaft, the connecting rods, the camshaft, everything inside that engine is working at a more relaxed pace. But here's the real advantage. Diesel torque comes on early and stays flat across a wide RPM range. A loaded truck climbing a grade doesn't need an engine that makes power at high revs. It needs an engine that makes massive torque right now, at low speed, under load. Diesel delivered exactly that. You could lug a diesel down to 1,200 RPM on a steep hill, and it would just pull. Try that with a gasoline engine, and you'd either stall it or grenade the transmission trying to downshift. Speaking of transmissions, gasoline engines were murder on drivetrains. All that revving, all those shifts, all that stress transferred through the clutch and gearbox and drive shaft. Truckers running gasoline were replacing clutches and rebuilding transmissions far more often than diesel operators. The construction of the engines themselves told the story. Diesel engines were built heavier. They had to be. Those compression ratios create enormous forces inside the cylinders, so diesel blocks were thicker. Crankshafts were more massive. Connecting rods were beefier. Why, all that extra metal meant the engines could handle the stress of commercial operation for hundreds of thousands of miles. A well-maintained Cummins diesel could run 500,000 miles before needing major internal work. Some went further. A gasoline big block in the same application rarely made it to 200,000 before it needed a rebuild, often less. Your car's engine works hard to make power. A diesel truck engine barely breaks a sweat at highway speed. That's not a small difference. That's why one lasted and one didn't. The engineering advantages were real. Thermal efficiency, fuel energy density, torque characteristics, construction durability. On paper, diesel won every category that mattered for heavy trucking. But theory doesn't pay bills. What mattered was what happened when fleet accountants started running the numbers. 1954, Columbus, Indiana. Cummins unveiled something that would become legendary in trucking circles. The NH series, 855 cubic inches of displacement. That number would become so iconic that decades later, truckers would still call any big Cummins an 855, even when the actual displacement had changed. The NH stood for a new approach. Previous diesel engines were good. This one was different. Cummins engineers had spent years studying what actually killed engines in real-world trucking, not laboratory conditions, not test stands. The brutal reality of American highways, mountain grades, and drivers who pushed equipment to the limit. What they built was over-engineered in all the right places. The block was massive. The crankshaft was forged from a single piece of steel. The cylinder liners were replaceable, which meant when an engine finally did wear out, you didn't scrap it. You rebuilt it, and rebuilt it again. Some of these engines would see 3 or 4 rebuilds over their service life, running for millions of miles total. The original NH produced around 200 horsepower. Respectable for the era. But here's where Cummins played the long game. They'd designed headroom into the architecture. The basic engine could handle more, much more. By the early 1960s, the NTC variant arrived. NTC 290, 290 horsepower, delivered reliably, consistently, for hundreds of thousands of miles. That reliability number mattered more than the horsepower figure. Any engine can make power. Making power while refusing to brake is the hard part. Fleet managers started running the numbers. A gasoline engine might cost less up front, but the NTC would burn half the fuel doing the same work. It would run twice as long before needing major service, and when it did need work, the parts were available everywhere. Cummins had built a dealer network across the country. You broke down in Nebraska, there was a Cummins shop within 100 miles, probably closer. The truck manufacturers noticed. Peterbilt had been building their own gasoline engines for years. Good engines, proven designs. But their customers kept asking for Cummins. The requests became demands. By the late 1950s, Peterbilt catalogs featured Cummins diesels prominently. The gasoline options were still there, but they were shrinking. Fewer models. Fewer configurations. Kenworth went through the same transition. In 1962, they shipped their last gasoline-powered W900. The sales numbers told the story. Drivers wanted diesel. Fleet managers demanded diesel. The accountants had already decided. Gasoline couldn't compete on operating costs, and operating costs were everything in trucking. Freightliner made Cummins their preferred option even earlier. They'd positioned themselves as the premium choice for owner-operators, and owner-operators understood fuel economy better than anyone. When you're paying for every gallon yourself, the math becomes personal. The dominoes fell quickly after that. Truck manufacturers stopped developing their own gasoline engines. Why invest millions in a technology your customers were abandoning? The engineering resources went elsewhere. Cab comfort, aerodynamics, suspension systems. Let Cummins handle the engines. By 1968, the transformation was essentially complete. Most Class 8 trucks sold in America were diesel-powered, not a slight majority. A commanding one. The gasoline big block, which had dominated heavy trucking for decades, was relegated to specialty applications and legacy fleets. The big three automakers read the market and made their decisions. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had all produced gasoline engines for heavy trucks. They'd invested in factories, tooling, engineering teams, but the writing was on the wall. One by one, they abandoned heavy truck gasoline engine development. The market had spoken. Cummins captured over 50% of the heavy-duty diesel market. On more than half of every big rig rolling down American highways carried a Cummins engine, from a company that had nearly gone bankrupt multiple times in its early years, from an engine architecture that competitors had dismissed as too heavy, too expensive, too complicated. When Peterbilt's catalog stopped listing gasoline engines entirely, nobody complained. No letters to the editor, no dealer protests, no customer outcry. The trucking industry had already moved on. Gasoline power in heavy trucks became a historical curiosity, something old-timers mentioned when talking about the early days. The engineering won, the economics won, the combination of torque, efficiency, and durability that diesel offered simply overwhelmed whatever advantages gasoline had claimed. But there's one more factor that sealed gasoline's fate, and it came from overseas, a crisis that nobody in the American trucking industry saw coming, but one that would prove everything Cummins had been saying for decades. October 1973. The phone rang in trucking offices across America, and the news was bad. OPEC had announced an oil embargo against the United States. Within weeks, fuel prices tripled. And for anyone still running gasoline trucks, the math went from uncomfortable to catastrophic. Now here's the thing. The gasoline big block was already losing the war. We've covered that. The efficiency gap, the torque disadvantage, the maintenance costs. Diesel had been winning on merit for years. But plenty of fleet operators were still holding on. They had gasoline trucks that ran fine. They had mechanics who knew those engines. They had relationships with dealers. Switching meant capital investment, retraining, disruption. So they waited. OPEC didn't give them that luxury anymore. There was a fleet operator in Texas who ran the numbers in November of '73. His name doesn't matter because his story was everyone's story that month. He had 12 gasoline trucks running regional routes. Good trucks, reliable, paid for. And suddenly they were losing 42 cents per mile, not revenue, net loss. Every mile those trucks rolled, he was paying for the privilege of moving freight. His diesel competitors were still making money. Not great money, but money. He sold the gasoline trucks for scrap value, ordered Cummins-powered replacements, took out loans he'd spent years paying off, but he survived. A lot of operators didn't. The fuel price spike exposed something that had been true for a while but easy to ignore. Gasoline trucks operated on razor-thin margins even in good times. A big block burning twice the fuel of a diesel meant your profit margin depended entirely on cheap gas. When gas was 30 cents a gallon, you could make it work. When gas hit $1, you couldn't. Simple as that. Fleet conversion happened faster than anyone predicted. Operators who'd planned to phase out gasoline over 5 years did it in 5 months. Some couldn't afford the transition and went under. Others merged with diesel-equipped competitors. The ones who'd already switched to Cummins watched their former rivals scramble and felt pretty smart about decisions they'd made years earlier. The used truck market tells the story better than any economic analysis. Before the embargo, a well-maintained gasoline truck held decent resale value. Not great, but decent. By early 1974, you couldn't give them away. Dealers had lots full of gasoline trucks nobody wanted. Some got converted to diesel, which cost more than the trucks were worth. Most just sat there, depreciating into scrap metal. A truck that cost $40,000 new might sell for $3,000 if you could find a buyer at all. And here's what really sealed it. The infrastructure shifted. Truck stops had always carried both gasoline and diesel, but pumps cost money. Space costs money. When 90% of your customers want diesel, you don't maintain 10 gasoline pumps. You maintain 2, maybe 1. The gasoline pumps got pulled out and replaced with more diesel capacity. Finding fuel for a gasoline truck became harder. Then it became a genuine logistical problem. Then it became nearly impossible on certain routes. Mechanic training programs noticed the same thing. Why teach students to work on gasoline big blocks when nobody was buying them? Vocational schools dropped the curriculum. Dealerships stopped hiring gasoline specialists. The knowledge base that kept those engines running started to disappear. Not because the engines were bad, because the economics made them irrelevant. By 1975, gasoline big blocks in heavy trucking were museum pieces, not metaphorically, actually in museums. The transition that might have taken another decade happened in about 18 months. Cummins couldn't build engines fast enough. Their factories ran 3 shifts. They hired everyone they could find. And still, customers waited months for delivery. The oil crisis didn't kill gasoline trucks. It just made the death happen faster. The verdict was already in. OPEC just accelerated the sentencing. What's interesting is what happened when fuel prices eventually stabilized. You might think gasoline would make a comeback. It didn't, not even close. The infrastructure was gone. The mechanics were gone. The manufacturing capacity was gone. The entire ecosystem that supported gasoline-heavy trucks had evaporated in less than 2 years. Even if someone wanted to build a gasoline truck in 1978, they'd have struggled to find parts, service, or fuel on the routes that mattered. Diesel had won so completely that the alternative simply ceased to exist. Fleet operators who'd converted weren't going back. They'd invested in diesel infrastructure, trained diesel mechanics, built relationships with diesel suppliers. The switching costs now favored diesel. The same inertia that had kept gasoline alive for too long now kept it dead. Cummins emerged from the oil crisis as the dominant force in American trucking. Their engines powered the majority of heavy trucks on the road. Their name became synonymous with reliability and efficiency. They'd bet on diesel when others hedged, and that bet paid off beyond anything Clessie Cummins could have imagined back in 1919. The gasoline big block's defeat was total. But what happened to the companies and workers who built them, and what did Cummins do with their victory? The revolution was complete, and the casualties were everywhere. International Harvester felt it first. The company that had once dominated American trucking found itself staring at a gasoline engine division that nobody wanted anymore. The factories in Fort Wayne and Indianapolis that had built big block truck engines for decades went quiet. Not because the engines were bad. They were excellent engines. They just burned the wrong fuel. The last engineer in International Harvester's gasoline truck engine division retired in 1979. His name doesn't appear in any history books. His skills, honed over 30 years of building some of the finest gasoline power plants in the industry, were simply obsolete. His son trained as a diesel mechanic. That's how fast the world turned. One generation built gasoline engines. The next generation couldn't even get a job working on them. Ford saw the writing on the wall and made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a decade earlier. They walked away from the heavy truck market entirely. The company that had put America on wheels, that had built trucks since 1917, decided that Class 8 vehicles weren't worth the fight anymore. By the early 80s, Ford's heavy truck division was history. They kept making medium-duty trucks, sure, but the big rigs, gone. General Motors followed the same path. The company that had once offered everything from economy cars to locomotives decided that competing with Cummins in the heavy truck diesel market was a losing proposition. They sold off their heavy truck operations and focused elsewhere. Two of the biggest names in American automotive history, companies that had shaped the industry for generations, simply surrendered the heavy truck market to diesel. And here's what's remarkable. Nobody tried to fight back with gasoline, not once. No manufacturer looked at the situation and said, maybe we can build a better gasoline engine. Maybe we can close the efficiency gap. Maybe we can make gasoline work at this scale. The technology had spoken. The economics had spoken. Gasoline was done in heavy trucking, and everyone knew it. What emerged instead was a diesel arms race. Detroit Diesel came roaring into the market with two-stroke engines that offered their own advantages. Caterpillar, already dominant in construction equipment, brought their expertise to highway trucks. Mack kept building their own diesels. But notice what all these competitors had in common. Every single one of them was diesel. The debate wasn't gasoline versus diesel anymore. That argument was settled. The debate was which diesel. Cummins had created a market and then had to defend it against diesel competitors. But they'd also proven something that changed the industry forever. They'd proven that a company focused entirely on engines rather than complete vehicles could dominate. They didn't build trucks, they built the hearts that made trucks run. And that focus paid off. The infrastructure transformation happened almost without anyone noticing. Truck stops that had once maintained separate islands for gasoline, and diesel trucks quietly reconfigured. The gasoline pumps for big rigs disappeared. Mechanics who had trained on both systems found themselves specializing exclusively in diesel. Training programs at community colleges and technical schools rewrote their curricula entirely. By the mid-'80s, a young person entering the trucking industry might never even learn how a gasoline big block worked. Why would they? There weren't any left to work on. An entire generation of mechanics who knew gasoline big blocks inside and out became dinosaurs. Their knowledge simply stopped mattering. The tricks they'd learned, the sounds they could diagnose, the feel of a properly tuned gasoline V8 under load. All of it became historical curiosity rather than practical skill. Some adapted. Many retired early. The industry moved on without them. Cummins grew into something Clessie could never have imagined. The company that had nearly gone bankrupt multiple times, that had survived on stubbornness and diesel fuel, became a Fortune 500 corporation. They employed over 60,000 people worldwide. Columbus, Indiana, the small town where Clessie had built his first engines, became a company town in the best sense. Cummins' money built schools, funded architecture, supported communities. One of Indiana's largest employers had grown from a machine shop where a self-taught engineer refused to give up on compression ignition. By 1985, the transformation was absolute. No manufacturer offered a gasoline option for Class 8 trucks. Not as a special order, not as a fleet option, not at any price. The gasoline big block, that magnificent piece of American engineering that had hauled freight across the country for decades, existed only in museums and the memories of old-timers. And the revolution that Clessie Cummins started in a small Indiana shop took 50 years. But when it won completely. Walk into any truck stop in America today. Go ahead, count the pumps. The commercial diesel lanes versus gasoline for big rigs. You won't need long. The ratio is about what you'd expect when one side won completely. Diesel powers over 95% of Class 8 trucks on American roads right now. Not 80%, not 90, 95. The gasoline big block didn't just lose market share, it got erased from the conversation entirely. And the engine sitting in most of those trucks? There's a decent chance it says Cummins on the side. The modern Cummins X15 is a direct descendant of that original NH architecture. Same basic philosophy, different execution. The bones are still there. High torque at low RPM, built for the long haul. Designed to run 1,000,000 miles if you treat it right. Clessie Cummins would recognize the thinking, even if the technology would blow his mind. Here's what's wild. The advantages that let diesel crush gasoline back in the 1950s and 60s, they still matter. Torque density, fuel efficiency, durability under load. The fundamental physics haven't changed. A diesel engine still extracts more work from every gallon of fuel. It still produces peak torque right where you need it for pulling heavy loads. It still runs cooler under sustained effort. Now, the emissions picture is completely different. Modern diesel engines produce a fraction of the pollutants their ancestors did. We're talking 98% reductions in some categories. Particulate filters, selective catalytic reduction, exhaust gas recirculation. The engineering that goes into making a modern diesel clean would fill its own video. But the core benefits? The reasons trucking companies chose diesel in the first place? Those haven't gone anywhere. Electric trucks are coming. Hydrogen fuel cells are in development. Tesla's Semi exists. Nikola is trying. The industry knows change is on the horizon. But here's the thing. Diesel isn't going quietly. The infrastructure is built. The supply chains are established. The maintenance knowledge is everywhere. Every truck stop, every mechanic, every parts supplier in America knows diesel. That's not nothing. And Cummins? The company Clessie started in a converted barn in Columbus, Indiana? It's now worth over $25 billion. Global operations. Tens of thousands of employees. They're not just making diesel engines anymore, they're investing in electric powertrains, hydrogen technology, natural gas systems. They saw what happened to companies that didn't adapt. They're not planning to be the next gasoline big block. But make no mistake, diesel is still their bread and butter, still the foundation, still what keeps the trucks moving and the economy running. 90 years after Clessie made that coast-to-coast drive to prove his engine could handle America, diesel trucks still dominate American highways. Some victories don't fade. Some technologies don't get replaced. They just get refined. Generation after generation. The same basic formula that worked in 1931 still works today. More power, more efficiency, more torque where it counts. And the gasoline big block had its moment. Those Hall Scott and Continental and Waukesha engines were impressive machines. They powered an industry through its growth years. They hauled freight across a nation building itself, but they never stood a chance. Not against an engine designed from the ground up to do exactly what trucking needed. Not against diesel. Not against Cummins. So here's the thing. The gasoline big block had everything going for it. The raw horsepower. The American muscle car appeal. The sound that made your chest vibrate when a truck rolled past. It was loud. It was dramatic. It was exactly what you'd expect to dominate American highways forever. But it didn't. The Cummins diesel won, not because it was flashier, not because it made better marketing copy. It won because it did the one thing that actually matters in trucking. It worked. Day after day, mile after mile, year after year. It just kept working. Clessie Cummins spent decades being told his diesel idea was impractical. Too heavy, too expensive, too complicated. He kept building them anyway. His engineers kept refining them. They solved the weight problem. They solved the reliability problem. They solved the fuel efficiency problem. And by the time the gasoline manufacturers realized what was happening, it was already over. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. Because fundamentals always win eventually. Torque beats horsepower for hauling, efficiency beats power for profit, and reliability beats everything when your livelihood depends on that engine starting every single morning. Today, those gasoline big blocks sit in museums. The Cummins diesels are still on the highway, still hauling, still working. If your father or grandfather drove trucks during the transition, ask them about it. They remember. And if you've got a gasoline big block story, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Subscribe if you want more engineering history. We do this every week.